Welcome to this class. I hope you guys are excited as I am to be teaching. Can everyone hear me okay, more or less? Okay, great. So I want to start out by getting a show of hands. I'm going to throw out a series of questions here. First, do any of you like to eat barbecue? Anyone? I do. I do twice. I love barbecue. Okay, what about with this really cold weather that we've been having lately? Has anyone had to bundle up and wear a parka or some kind of, parka-like down jacket, keep warm? Yeah. Definitely. Okay, this is going to take you probably many years back. In elementary school, did anyone ever learn to multiply numbers? Sometimes they had zeros in them, like 104 times 22, something like that. Yeah? Okay, sorry. Let me move this up a bit. Yeah, I asked in elementary school, did you ever learn to multiply numbers that had zeros in them, like 104 times 20, something like that? Yeah, okay. Anyone driven down the Natchez Trace? Or if you have Chicago background, anyone go on the diagonal streets that cut across the grid in town? Okay, so we've got a lot of people doing all these things. You might be able to guess something that these all had in common is that these were invented by Native American peoples living in North or South America or Central America or the Caribbean. Moreover, if you speak English and use any of these words in your daily speech, you may be surprised to hear that these are all from Native American languages. Hundreds of Native American languages were here before the Europeans came at all. If any of you speak Spanish, you have even more words that are part of the vocabulary that come from Native American tongues. Okay, so if you were an undergrad class, I would sort of take you through the course and let you get the main idea bit by bit, on your own. But everyone here has been around the block a bit. You're probably already anticipating where I'm going with this. So I'm going to just lay this out here at the front so we're all on the same page. Every class of the next 6 weeks, I'm going to be reinforcing the same take-home idea. Really, there's kind of 3 points to this idea. So everything that we talk about is going to lead up to this main point, which is that Native American cultures deserve to be part of our study of history. The Native Americans made incredible civilizations long before they even came into contact with Spanish or other European peoples. And they aren't just some kind of footnote. They're actually, part of our culture today. Native Americans are part of our society, and this is something that's alive and well. So there's 3 points that I want to get to with this. The first point is that Native American cultures, before the Europeans came, were every bit as complex, advanced, cosmopolitan, creative, and technologically savvy as any ones that were in the old world. So when we think of Rome and Greece, ancient Egypt, even Mesopotamia, China, Native Americans were part of this too. And often they're kind of put to the side in our narratives of the development of world history, but they shouldn't be and they don't deserve to be. Symptomatic of this is the common perception, this is disturbingly, increasingly common, that the great accomplishments of the New World, like the Maya cities, had to be built by someone other than Native Americans, like aliens. You get all these ancient alien shows, Atlantis, people from across the sea, like China. But this is not borne out. It's patently, we know this is obviously not the case. And in fact, we know for a fact that it was all of these accomplishments were created by the ancestors of people like these, people who are still with us today. And it's a disservice to them to pretend otherwise because we know better. The second point that I want to get across in the course is that the accomplishments of these people didn't die out after the arrival, these peoples didn't die out after Europeans got here. There's still millions of Native Americans, not only in North America and in the US and Canada, but also in South America and in Central America, who are their descendants and who still form part of our societies. So you might talk about the ancient Maya, but the Maya are very much still around. They never went anywhere. And if you spend any time in Latin America, you can just see this reflected in people's faces. Native Americans are still here. So these aren't just, something long gone, something long past that disappeared in 1492. These people are still here. Okay. And the third point that I want to make is that the way in which we deal with these people's past matters. This isn't just an arcane question about history, but the way in which we understand Native American civilizations is important, and it has consequences too. Among other areas, the way we understand the American past impacts legal systems, cultural diversity, dealing with the environment, how we approach environmental policy, that's a big one. Economic systems, media representation, and so on. So I would say that the American past has teeth. In other words, this is a very loaded topic. Okay, so those are the main points that I hope you come to see by the end of these 6 weeks. At this point, I want to step back and give you a bit of an overview of the course. First things first, I plan to present a lecture for about an hour, and then I'll leave time for questions from you guys. We're going to be spending each week focusing on a different civilization of the ancient Americas, of either North, Central, or South America. So we're going to start with the Aztec and then study the Maya. From there, we'll study the Inca, and from there we move into perhaps lesser-known territory. We'll look at the Moche, which were a society that lived in the desert of Peru. And then we'll come up to our own backyard and study Cahokia and the Mississippians, which were just in Tennessee and many other surrounding states. And then we'll wrap up with the Amazon, which I'm very excited about. This is some very cutting-edge research. Our understanding of the Amazon has completely changed even within the past 10 years, and this is still going on. We could be studying many other cultures too. This just gives you an idea of how many important civilizations, how many important crystallizations of cultural accomplishments there were in the New World at this time. So we don't nearly have enough space to focus on all these, but you get this idea. There were incredible accomplishments all over the New World for a long time. And then I'm going to maybe discuss this next week more. I would like to organize a field trip, too, at the end of the course to the site of Mound Bottom, which is located west of town in Kingston Springs. Obviously, it's cold out. You're going to have to walk, so it depends on you guys, but I would like to do that. This is a great Mississippian site, really in our own backyard. And then the last thing is, if any of you have some personal connection to the course material, if any of you are Native American or Hispanic or have Native American ancestry, I'd love at any point to hear your contributions, to hear your perspectives on this course matter, or even if you've been to any of these sites or otherwise have any particular interest, please feel free to contribute, or even come and talk to me at the end. Thanks. Even come at the end of class if you want to hear about a particular subject, because there's some flexibility. So if you have something of interest, just let me know. And to give you some idea of why I'm the one up here, like Bob said, I'm Anna, and I just came from University of Chicago. I got my degree in anthropology, specializing in archaeology. I work in Peru, and the area I study was known as Chachapoyas. It was home to people that lived there between AD 1000 to 1450 when it was conquered by the Inca. This is a great area. It's located right in between the high Andes and the Amazon. So basically what it looks like is rainforest at 10,000 feet above sea level. So it's just a beautiful area. Actually, the inspiration for the first scene in Indiana Jones when there's the big rock rolling. That's the people I study. And I focus on architecture and on daily life. So I'll talk a little bit about my research in the week that we get to the Inca. So, without further ado, let's get started and talk about the Aztecs today. So the Aztecs, in some ways, are the Native American civilization that we probably are most familiar with from the New World, or at least we think that we're most familiar with the Aztecs. The Aztecs were the first time that Europeans, or people from the Old World, came across a civilization that they had no idea even existed beforehand. They didn't, and I'm sorry, this was the first time that the Europeans encountered a society that they had no idea existed, which was rivaling their own. It was just as big, just as impressive, just as technologically advanced, and as beautiful as what they were used to. And they didn't know what to make of this. This didn't fit in their view of the world. Think how much everything was upended, when they found that, when Galileo found the sun at the center of the solar system. So imagine finding this huge other world in your own backyard that you didn't even know was there. How do you make sense of that? And I would argue that for 500 years, we've still been trying to make sense of this, to try to fit this in our understandings of the world. We envision our own past starting with Greece and Rome and, moving up from there. But we see that there's this whole, parallel center of development in the world. So we're still trying to make sense of this in a bit of a way. And the way that the Aztecs are typically presented in history books is through the eyes of the Europeans, as the Europeans saw them. So in this course, or in this class today, rather, I'm going to be, helping us get to understand the Aztecs in part through the ways that the Spanish saw them, but also I want to peel that back. And archaeology can help us in this effort in getting to understand the Aztecs through their own perspective, how they themselves were, rather than just through the lens of how the Spanish saw them. I'm sorry, what was that? Down or? Okay. Can you guys hear me over on this side? Okay. Okay. Oh, okay. A lanyard? Okay. Okay. Sorry about that. In the middle?
Exactly.
Or would it help if I just kind of stand more centrally? Yeah.
If it's on this lapel, if you face that way, it's not going to pick it up nearly as well as if you're facing center or this way.
Right.
So that's the difference.
Okay.
So what do you think about this, John? This is what I'm hoping I can get it with the lanyard. I can get it right.
As long as she knows what's going on, I don't know how to get rid of that.
I think you have to just keep closing it.
It should be done.
Want to try it?
Okay. How is this? Can you guys hear me now? Yes. Yes. Okay. I'll try to not turn my head too much since that's the problem. Okay. So Mexico, 1517 AD. This is the story that, in general, we're familiar with more or less. Cortez gets to Mexico. We have several, main actors here in the story as it's traditionally told. Hernán Cortés was born in Spain, but he spent much of his life in the Caribbean by this point. The Spanish, had been in the Caribbean since 1492. So by 1517, they'd had several decades in the New World. He starts to move the process on further westward by going to Mexico. He takes several hundred, about 630 Spanish men, also some women, also not necessarily all white Spanish people. They take 3 ships and land in Veracruz in Mexico, and after marching across Mexico, they encounter the king of the Aztecs, Moctezuma II, sometimes known as Montezuma. Through these exploits, Cortez is aided by 2 translators, actually. Malinche, whose proper name was actually Malintzin. This woman has become a symbol of the melding of cultures in Mexico and the New World. She was the daughter of a chief and raised in a multilingual area in eastern Mexico. So she grew up speaking Maya and the language of the Aztecs, Nahuatl. She became Cortez's translator. They also worked with another translator who knew Spanish and Maya. So through these multiple people, they were able to communicate, to make some headway into Mexico. So these are the main characters that we normally hear about in this drama. Cortez gets to central Mexico. At first, the conquistadors are welcomed into Tenochtitlan, the Mexican capital. After a short amount of time, things go awry. The Spanish capture Moctezuma, and then he's executed after a while. The Aztecs throw the Spanish out of the capital, and the Spanish regroup. They mount a siege. In the meantime, epidemic sweeps through Tenochtitlan, the capital, and after a while, the Spanish are able to regroup, recharge, come back, and then conquer the Aztecs' capital and the Aztec Empire with the help of other Native American allies, the Tlaxcala. So this is the story. This for many of us is the extent of what we hear about the Aztecs in our history books, but this was just the smallest of slivers of Aztec history. The Aztecs had several hundred years of imperial conquest behind them, and the people that made up the Aztec Empire didn't die out after this event, too. They're still there today. Mexico City is still there today. So for the rest of today, I want to get into the Aztec world that was there in place before this to see what actually the conquistadors encountered. So the Aztec Empire. What actually does the word Aztec mean? Because this doesn't refer to a group of people exactly. It's a little more complicated than that. So when we say the Aztec, what we're actually referring to is a political entity known properly as the Triple Alliance. This was an alliance of 3 city-states that were located, I don't know where to put this. These were located around Lake Texcoco in the highlands of Mexico. So these 3 city-states were Tlacopan, Texcoco, and Tenochtitlan, which was the most powerful and prominent of these. Those 3 images you see at the bottom are the symbols of each of these city-states. So at some point in the 1300s, these 3 city-states formed an alliance against the other city-states in the area. And together they were able to grow and expand and conquer large portions of central Mexico. In between the areas that they conquered, they also there were a number of powerful groups that they were not able to successfully conquer that they just left for the time being. This would come back to haunt them later on. So this is the area that we're talking about when we think of the Aztec Empire. So at the heart of the Aztec world was the city of Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs were an urban civilization, and it was an urban world unlike anything that the Europeans were familiar with at the time. Tenochtitlan was located in the center of Lake Texcoco. If any of you have been to Mexico City today, you will notice that Mexico City no longer is in the middle of a lake. The city has grown over since then, so now it takes up the whole area. But at that time, there was an enormous lake, and there were islands at the center, and this is where Tenochtitlan was founded. Tenochtitlan was huge. It was 3 to 5 square miles in area. Its population was several hundred thousand, so probably 1 to 300,000 or so. This was as big as any city in Europe at the time. The biggest ones at that time would have been Paris, Venice, Constantinople. And by way of comparison, Tenochtitlan was 5 times bigger than London of that day. So this was truly an enormous city that the Spanish wandered into. The origin story of how Tenochtitlan came about was very important to the Aztecs. The Aztecs believed that they descended from a group of wandering people. Actually, this group, this ethnic group that they saw themselves as, was known as the Mexica. I do not have that up there. The Mexica, spelled M-E-X-I-C-A, is where the name Mexico comes from today. So the Aztecs believe that they, the Mexica, had come from further north. Archaeologists still aren't really clear where this is, maybe in the southwest somewhere or northwest Mexico. They left their homeland and wandered through the desert, and they were led by their patron deity, Huitzilopochtli, who had told them he would give them a sign where they would find their new city, their new homeland. And that sign was going to be a golden eagle that was perched on top of a prickly pear cactus. This is actually a delicious fruit that you can see starting to appear in our grocery stores now. So the eagle would be perched on this prickly pear cactus and eating a snake in its claws. So this sign, the Aztecs finally encountered. They finally saw this in the middle of Lake Texcoco, and Huitzilopochtli told them, here you're going to build your city. So they found it there. And this event, this origin narrative, is commemorated in the Mexican flag in the central portion there. So to get a sense of how important this origin narrative was to the Aztecs, you might recall another wandering tribe in the desert, the Israelites. They had left Egypt. They were looking for their new homeland too, led by Yahweh. And once they found their new homeland in Palestine, this became so important for them that even thousands of years later, we're still the whole world is still experiencing the effects of this connection with their homeland, with their place. So for the Aztecs, Tenochtitlan, this new site, had the same kind of importance, of significance and resonance. Tenochtitlan could be described as an American Venice. We have these beautiful murals by the artist Diego Rivera. I apologize for this thing popping up here. The city was built on the lake on lots of different islands, so it was crisscrossed by canals. You had to take canoes to move through the different portions of the city. There was actually a profession in Tenochtitlan of urban planners who designed the layout of the city. This position was known as the Kalmi Milocatl. And the city was laid out in a grid, in a beautiful, very orderly, organized grid. This was actually not typical of most Aztec cities, but this was done specially in Tenochtitlan in accordance with cosmological principles. So it was, in effect, a divinely ordained layout to the city. It had 4 quarters, and each of these quarters was made up of a lot of different neighborhoods. At the center of the city, laser pointer, so kind of right in the center here, was the main public precinct, and it had about 45 public and ritual buildings. A number of these were temples and other ritual spaces. There was also the royal palace and the places associated with it. We know from Spanish accounts, but also from archaeological evidence corroborating this, there was a zoo associated with the royal palace. There was also a botanical garden, which was something that had not yet been invented in Europe at that time. Okay. The city was supported in part by agriculture that took place on the fringes of the city. So the Aztecs invented this system of farming called chinampas, floating gardens, or floating terraces, I guess, floating plots. These were man-made small islands built up of lake muck, of reeds and dirt. And these allowed agriculture to go on right outside the city center. These are very fertile. They also provided, in the canals between them, you could harvest lake resources like fish and ducks and things like that. And they were very fertile because you could just bring up muck from the lake and deposit it on top to increase the soil productivity. Another very notable thing that the Spanish pointed out with great astonishment in their chronicles was another kind of fertilizer, which was human manure. Tenochtitlan was extremely clean. The Spanish just marveled at how clean the streets were, unlike anything they had known. There were actually public lavatories placed throughout the city, and the people whose job it was to clean these out would come around, collect the waste, and then they would haul it out in their canoes to these plots and use it as fertilizer. So there was a very efficient form of recycling, actually. And in the end result, the city was cleaner, the citizens were healthier. So here was the Templo Mayor was at the center of the city in the main ritual precinct. There were a lot of temples, but this was the most important. Templo Mayor would translate to the great temple, more or less. And you can still see it in Mexico City today, where it has been unearthed by archaeologists. You can get a sense of the size of the temple placed in contemporary Mexico City. On top of this temple were two smaller temples that were dedicated to two different gods. One of these was the patron god of the Aztecs, Huitzilopochtli, the one who had led them to their homeland. He was the god of war. And the second temple was dedicated to Quetzalcoatl, who was the feathered serpent. This god had been worshipped by the Maya and by other people in Mesoamerica and Central America for a long time before. So there are these two twin gods at the very heart of Aztec civic life. And Aztec society was also very hierarchically divided. At the top, of course, was the ruler and the other hereditary elites. Below that, there were other elites who had gained that position through their skill in warfare. And then there was a class of commoners. There were, below that, a class of dedicated merchants who could actually become quite wealthy. And then there were a lot of slaves, too. Some of these were born slaves, some were captured through warfare, and other slaves became slaves by voluntarily doing this in order to pay off debts, like indentured servants, I suppose. Each of the neighborhoods in Tenochtitlan had its own market. So markets were really a very vibrant part of life in the city. If you've been to Mexico or other parts of Latin America, you really get a sense of the vibrancy and excitement of markets. It's a place where people could come together and just be overwhelmed with the array of things stimulating the senses. The biggest market in Tenochtitlan was in the area of Tlatelolco, and this is where you can see the remains of Tlatelolco today. This market was so large that it had about 10,000 people coming there, buying and selling on an everyday basis. And the Spanish were extremely impressed by this market when they first saw it, and they compared it very favorably to markets in Europe of the day. And I would like to actually read you a passage from one of the Spanish chroniclers that describes the market when he got there. So to give you a sense of the first-hand experience, because we have this sense that the Spanish came, they saw this area as their own, they took it, by force. But in reality, when you read the first-hand accounts, you get a sense of how impressed people were, how awed and a little bit scared. They didn't know what they didn't know what they're up against. They had no concept of what this was. So the account really just rings with wonder, and it's a great read. So this is by Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who was one of the people in Cortez's army that arrived in Tenochtitlan. And he wrote down his impressions about 30 or 40 years later. The whole book is really interesting if you get a chance. Okay. So he says, on reaching the marketplace, escorted by the many leaders whom Montezuma had assigned to us, we were astounded at the great number of people and the quantities of merchandise, and at the orderliness and good arrangements that prevailed, for we had never seen such a thing before. Let us begin with the dealers in gold, silver, and precious stones, feathers, cloaks, and embroidered goods, and male and female slaves who are also sold there. They bring as many slaves to be sold in that market as the Portuguese bring Negroes from Guinea. Next, there were those who sold coarser cloth and cotton goods and fabrics made of twisted thread, and there were chocolate merchants with their chocolate. In this way, you could see every kind of merchandise to be found anywhere in New Spain, laid out in the same way as goods are laid out in my own district of Medina del Campo in Spain. All of these were kept in one part of the market in the place assigned to them, and in another part were skins of tigers and lions, otters, jackals, and deer, badgers, mountain cats, and other wild animals, some tanned and some untanned, and other classes of merchandise. There were sellers of kidney beans and sage and other vegetables and herbs in another place, and in yet another they were selling fowls and turkeys, rabbits, hares, deer, young ducks, little dogs, chihuahuas, and other such creatures. Then there were the fruiterers, and the women who sold cooked food, flour and honey cake and tripe had their part of the market. Then came pottery of all kinds, from big water jars to little jugs, displayed in its own place. Also honey paste, and other sweets like nougat. Elsewhere they sold timber, too, boards, cradles, beams, blocks, and benches, all in accord with their own. But why waste so many words on the goods in their great market? If I describe everything in detail, I shall never be done. Let us leave the market, having given it a final glance, and come to the courts and enclosures in which their great temples stood. Before reaching it, you pass through a series of large courts, bigger, I think, than the plaza at Salamanca in Spain. These courts were surrounded by a double masonry wall and paved, like the whole place, with very large, smooth, white flagstones. Where these stones were absent, everything was whitened and polished. Indeed, the whole place was so clean that there was not a straw or a grain of dust to be found there. We saw the fresh water which came from Chapultepec to supply the city, and the bridges that were constructed at intervals on the causeway so that the water could flow in and out from one part of the lake to another. We saw a great number of canoes, some coming with provisions and others returning with cargo and merchandise. And we saw, too, that one could not pass from one house to another of that great city and the other cities except over wooden drawbridges or by canoe. We saw temples and shrines in these cities that looked like gleaming white towers and castles, a marvelous sight. So this is the best, the most beautiful of Aztec civilization, the jewel of Tenochtitlan. But another equally well-known aspect of Aztec society was their penchant for human sacrifice and for violence. And these are difficult things for historians, for archaeologists to grapple with, because on the one hand we have this incredibly accomplished, aesthetically knowledgeable society with these beautiful sensibilities, and on the other hand they engage in these very gruesome, really, really chilling acts of violence at the very heart of their city. And it would be convenient if we could dismiss this as an over-exaggeration on the part of the Spanish, but we know that this was not the case. Over and over in Aztec art and in archaeological finds, we see that this was definitely going on. It's exemplified, for example, in these skull racks, which were sort of symbolic of human skulls. These are placed in the main temple area. In some cases, these were actually racks with literal human skulls placed on them too. These are sacrificial knives, chillingly, anthropomorphized like little hungry people. The Spanish killed, or I'm sorry, the Spanish. The Aztecs in their main Templo Mayor carried out staggeringly large events of ritual sacrifice, killing up to several thousand people at a time in these major events. So what happened? So how do we reconcile this? How do we make sense of this, and how do we grapple with it? Because it's a very obvious part of Aztec society, and almost unrivaled in any other ancient society. So the first thing to think about this is to put it in a bigger context. Human sacrifice was just one very visible form of ritual practice. The Aztecs in general were an extremely religious society. So ritual practices were just suffused all elements of their lives. They carried out rituals on an everyday basis in their households, in their communities, at their small community temples too. There were ritual cycles and calendars. So, there are all these events going on, really on an everyday basis, pretty much. So human sacrifice was just one part of this bigger thing. Another point to keep in mind is that for pretty much everyone in the whole world before the past 100 years, death had a very different meaning. Death was much more a part of your life. It was inescapable. So before modern medicine, people just died in higher numbers at younger ages and so on. So death wasn't something just set aside. It was something that you had to think about, you had to grapple with. Aztecs had a beautiful culture of elite poetry, and much of it deals with this theme of death and evanescence in life on Earth. More specifically, Aztecs understood that the world, in effect, ran on death. Their understanding was that the sun was created when one of their gods, here's some of the Aztec deities, when one of their gods killed himself. He leapt into a fire, with ritual self-immolation, and then he emerged as the sun. So in order for the sun to keep going, it had to, they asked humans basically to step up to the plate. Humans had to give of themselves too, just the way that the gods had. And in particular, what the sun ran on, its kind of fuel, was this substance called tonali, which was found in blood, even more so in human blood, and especially in the blood of elites. So elite sacrifices were valued even more than those of commoners or slaves. So the Aztecs understood that only by means of human sacrifice would the world keep going. And this connection between death and life, in particular between death and violence and fertility and blood, this is something that we're going to see in other cultures too as we go through the course. This was a common theme in the ancient Americas. The fact that life, the continuance of life and growth, was dependent on some individuals perishing and giving of their lives and their vital blood to that end. And this seems strange. This seems a little dark to many of our thinking. How could you premise your whole worldview on this kind of dark need for blood? But it's actually not entirely absent from our own way of thinking. In the Christian tradition, of course, at the very center of beliefs is the sacrifice of Christ. So in this other way of thinking, the world also is dependent on one individual's sacrifice, and that's celebrated every week in the drinking of blood. So this sounds very strange, but when you put it in perspective, you can see echoes of similar principles at work here too. Another thing to keep in mind is that many people around the world in the ancient past practiced human sacrifice. New World peoples were definitely not alone in this. You can find human sacrifice in ancient Europe, China, Africa. Basically look for it, and it's there in some level. Basically the only thing that makes Aztecs stand out is the scale that it took place. Another interesting to think about is that in Europe at the same time, hundreds of people would come in these public spectacles to see people get executed, and they enjoyed it. Think Braveheart with the drawing and the quartering. This was not something that was unknown to Europeans. Even in the U.S., you get the hangings early on in American history, public hangings in the main square. So Europeans did have the tools in their mind to think about this. So in some sense, they would have been familiar with it. But to me, one of the most powerful explanations of human sacrifice is to put it in perspective, because when you realize this was not something that all members of Aztec society necessarily supported. Human sacrifice was really the purview of the elites, and it was a vital part of state religion. So one way that we can understand human sacrifice is as a kind of propaganda. It displayed the power of the Aztec state over human life, their ability to take life as they wished, to kill the captives that they had captured in warfare, often from other areas. So every time the Aztecs carried out this very visible form of execution, people from throughout the Aztec Empire, it was reinforced in their minds that the Aztecs were in control. So this is actually confirmed, or the idea that this was, an elite thing, not necessarily supported by all members of the population, is confirmed through archaeological evidence. Archaeologists who have focused on households, on everyday life, have noted that the rituals that took place in everyone's homes were not, for the most part, focused on warfare, on temples, on sacrifice. But what you see instead is lots of clay figurines of women, of children, of themes related to just fertility and the continuance, the well-being of the household. So for most people, they're just trying to keep going about their daily lives. They were forcibly integrated into this system of violence and warfare and expansion. But it was something that was something apart from them. It was not necessarily a value that they celebrated. So it's important to keep in mind that there were differences in Aztec society, to not just say, the Aztecs and assume that everyone was on the same page, because there were different classes, there were different ways of thinking, just as in our own society. So human sacrifice was also part of a bigger culture of war. The Aztecs were a culture of warfare. Their values for both men and women were things like bravery, prowess, and power. Like I mentioned before, it was actually possible to move up the social ranks by demonstrating your prowess and success in warfare. The Aztecs had special military orders in their army. Think like the Green Berets, the Navy SEALs, something like that. They had these special factions. And the most famous of these was the Eagle Warriors, seen in this beautiful statue of an eagle warrior found from Mexico City. The central precinct of Tenochtitlan contained a special sort of school or club or training facility for the young eagle warriors, which is this, the building that you see down here. It's actually been identified by archaeologists where it was previously unknown. But more generally, throughout the Aztec Empire, every community had schools for the young boys to attend in which they would learn martial arts. Commoners would learn to become warriors, whereas the boys of the elite families would learn to become generals or also priests. So this is really inculcated in all members of Aztec society. And even women were part of this. Much like in ancient Sparta, where women had to themselves become tough in order to bear strong Spartan soldiers. Aztec women were understood as warriors in some sense, and the process of giving birth was likened to a successful conquest, successful capture in warfare. So women were also understood to be to be warriors too, in a way. Okay. An important thing to remember, though, about Aztec warfare is that it was quite different than how we understand warfare from the Old World. So when we think of an ancient empire like Rome, it was about acquiring territory. So when Rome would conquer a new area, they would turn it into a province. They would completely revamp the infrastructure. They would try to turn people into Roman citizens, to make them Romans, and change their lives from the top down. The Aztec Empire was very different. This was not their goal at all. What the Aztecs were after in their warfare was really tribute and acquiring goods to support the lavish lifestyle of the elites. Each time an Aztec army would conquer a city-state in central Mexico, they would leave the rulers in place, they would leave the infrastructure in place, they would change very little, but what they required was tribute flowing in to Tenochtitlan, consisting of luxury goods and also staple goods to support the city of Tenochtitlan. So this manuscript here gives you some sense of the goods that were owed to Tenochtitlan. This is an early colonial manuscript here. What did people owe for tribute in the New World? Some of these things included cotton mantles, cochineal dye, this bright red dye that was very valuable later for the Europeans too. Feathers, precious stones, gold and copper, staple crops, chili, honey, salt, cacao, animal skins, shells, lime for making plaster for houses, wood, incense, rubber, paper, and so on. So there's a very wide variety of goods. Apart from warfare, trade and exchange and markets were just a very important part of society, not just for the Aztecs, but for many peoples that lived in Mesoamerica in the pre-Hispanic world. There were markets in every community, various larger and smaller markets. There were rotating markets that would take place, essentially once a week, something like that. Things that continue on in contemporary Latin America when you go down there. There was a special class of merchants that would travel between towns bearing goods. Here's an Aztec representation of a merchant carrying a bundle on his back. There were no beasts of burden. Humans carried all of their own goods. In Mesoamerica, same thing in the Andes. No, they had llamas in the Andes, but we'll get to that. But there were humans, carrying all of this on their backs. A lot of the goods that people used on a daily basis, they would make in their homes, things like pots or stone tools for getting a sharp edge for cutting things. But then there were more specialized goods, too, that people dedicated themselves to full-time for creating. This feather shield is one example of that kind of elite artisan good. The Aztecs were actually very adept at feather work, but this is a tradition that is in large part invisible today because feathers are so fragile and perishable, so there are very few examples of feather work. The artisans that made these elite goods, things like gold and silver and jade and so on, lived in special dedicated neighborhoods. This was a hereditary profession, so fathers taught their sons how to do feather work and so on. And these were all in the capital of Tenochtitlan. Okay. So we have all these values of elite goods, of warfare, of sacrifice, these things that we've talked about that in our minds are very synonymous with Aztec society and Aztec culture. But as I pointed out before, the vast majority of the population would have just been concerned with getting by, like most people in world history. So for every Aztec elite living in the central precinct, wearing feathers and gold and eating fine foods, there were millions of other people living in their own homes, concerned about surviving childbirth, concerned about raising their children properly. This document here demonstrates the values that Aztec parents taught to their children. So fathers would teach their sons how to farm and how to fish. Aztec mothers would teach their daughters how to make tortillas and how to weave, which were the essential feminine skills. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this in every class, but it's important to keep in mind in the background that for all these beautiful artistic accomplishments we talk about, they're also everyone else just going about their daily lives, supporting the people at the top too. And archaeologists are increasingly gaining interest in these ordinary people and studying their lives. This is what I'm interested in for one. Okay. So we've had a bit of an overview of some of the salient aspects of Aztec society. So now we get to the burning question, probably, that you came to this course wanting to know, is what happened? In the end, in 1517, actually in 1521, how did a little group of several hundred Europeans who were just overwhelmed, who are in some ways a ragtag band of adventurers, not even trained soldiers, how did they come to conquer millions of people in Mexico and again in other parts of the New World too? How did this happen? This is very strange and difficult to understand, and was not inevitable. So I'm just going to tell you guys now. I'm going to deal with this question now, and then we're going to put it away for the rest of the course and focus on what came before this, because this is, of course, very important to understand. It set the stage for colonial history, for modern history in Latin America. But too often we get hung up on this question. It really forms the bulk of our inquiries about ancient Native America, when in reality it's just one chapter among many. before the Aztecs, there had been a lot of civilizations in Mexico that had risen and fallen. So this was just really, one example of conquest, one example of collapse. Okay, so to get on to that, is anyone here familiar with Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel? A few people have read that. Okay, so this book is a very influential, it represents a very influential strain of thinking and understanding how Europeans came to conquer New World peoples. And in essence, what he argues is that Europeans brought with them more advanced weaponry, including steel and guns, but also horses and very powerful large dogs, things like that. So in part it was weaponry, in part it was diseases that they brought with them from the Old World. So weaponry is a bit more debated nowadays as to whether that really was a major factor, because Native Americans had some extremely powerful weapons themselves. For instance, Aztecs had war clubs made of obsidian, which in fact can be cut sharper than a surgeon's scalpel. So this too was quite powerful. But without a doubt, disease was an incredibly important factor. It is almost impossible to overemphasize the scale and the impact the disease had on New World populations. So for those who haven't heard this idea yet, basically Europeans brought with them diseases, smallpox being one of the foremost, when they came to the New World. Europeans had been living with these diseases, developing immunity for thousands and thousands of years. Same obviously with Africans, with Asians, everyone in the Old World. Native Americans had not. And the reasons for this are debated somewhat. On the one hand, there were very few domesticated animals comparatively. The biggest domesticated animal in the New World was the llama and the alpaca. Whereas in the Old World, you had pigs, sheep, goats, cows, horses, and so on. So, since animals are often vectors for the transmission of diseases, New World peoples had less experience with exposure to these animal-borne diseases. This would be one reason for this. In some cases, Native Americans actually had much greater standards of hygiene and cleanliness, like we saw with Tenochtitlan. So you weren't, when you weren't living in filth, you weren't constantly exposed to diseases as much. But another important factor is that if you think back to way back history, Native Americans' original ancestors, for the most part, came over the land bridge from the Bering Strait from Asia. So these are very small populations, and from there they grew to millions and millions of people over time. But the upshot of this is that there was much less genetic diversity, or there still is, much less genetic diversity among New World peoples than is true of people coming from the Old World. So when a new disease was encountered, there were less different possibilities for biological responses to it. So in the end, what happened was that when new diseases came in, New World peoples were hit hard, and they had very few of their own diseases to give back to Europe. Syphilis probably being the main one, the only one that we know of probably. It's pretty bad too. So the impact when the Spanish and other Europeans got here was incredible. Not too liberal estimates, pretty conservative estimates for most societies of the New World, put the death toll at 70 to 90% of the population within 50 to 100 years of contact with Europeans. So let's imagine that 130 of the people in this room would die. Just extraordinary levels of death. Without a doubt, the single greatest loss of human life in human history, just without a doubt. And not only was this, just people were gone, there's just the gross loss of life, the impact was psychological. Some of these diseases were just horrifying. I considered looking up some pictures of smallpox to put in this presentation to kind of get a sense, because it's easy to say smallpox, it's not something we deal with nowadays. it was too gruesome. I'm just not I'm not going to put any of these in here. So it's just terrible to look at, to think about. Then there's the psychological and emotional toll of not just losing a loved one, but almost all of your loved ones at once. And then there's the effect that it had on native infrastructure. In a very important example that we're going to talk about later on, the king of the Inca died of smallpox, and as a result, civil war precipitated. And at that precise moment, the Spanish came in and were able to take enormous advantage of that situation. So imagine if the president and 80% of Congress suddenly died. The country would be thrown into chaos. You might deal with it, but it'd be really, really difficult, and it would certainly upend things. So disease really can't be overstated. And in many cases, it actually moved on in advance of Europeans as native peoples interacted with each other. So by the time the Europeans arrived in a place, they were already seeing societies that had been decimated by its ravages. So that's a huge something that definitely worked in favor of Cortez. A second factor that Jared Diamond doesn't really consider a whole lot, but was undeniably important, was the native allies that helped the Spanish and the other European powers in their conquest. La Malinche, Cortez's interpreter, would be one small example of this. But Cortez also relied on thousands of Tlaxcalan, ethnically Tlaxcalan people to help conquer the Aztec. So keep in mind when we say the Aztec Empire, the Inca Empire, we're really talking about an empire. And if you're the one on top in the empire, it's real nice to be part of an empire. But for most of the people being conquered by empires, they're not very happy with that. And actually, the people that I study, the Chachapoyans, are famous for resisting the Inca. They hated the Inca. For 50 years, the Inca tried to conquer them. They kept resisting. And you know what? When the Spanish showed up just down the street next door, the Chachapoyans were among the first to show up and volunteer to try to enlist the Spanish in helping them to overthrow the Inca. So when Europeans arrived, in the case of the Aztecs and the Inca, they found many native peoples ready to help them, hoping to change the situation. And what they didn't understand is that their new overlords were going to be much, much worse than the ones that they had previously. So those are some of the main factors in European conquest. It's a very complex subject, and there's other factors involved too. The upshot of this, is that the Aztec Empire collapsed, and Aztec peoples still continued, but the Aztec culture was lost forever at this point. So in conclusion for today, we tend to think of the Aztecs, when we do think of them, as bloodthirsty and brutal, but the reality is actually more complex. On the one hand, what we tend to associate with the Aztecs when we think of them is elite culture, the items that the people at the top were using. And we're not really thinking about the lives of ordinary people, the bulk of the population. On the other hand, the Aztecs did create extraordinarily beautiful and very technologically advanced accomplishments, like the city of Tenochtitlan, like these beautiful pieces of art that you can see here. And if you go to Mexico City, the National Museum there is just full of incredible pieces. I want to leave you for today with a poem, which I alluded to. The Aztec elite had quite a tradition of poetry. So I'm going to read you a poem by one of the kings who lived in the mid-1400s. And it treats with that same theme that we saw before of the evanescence of life and of the omnipresence of death. Okay. All the earth is a grave, and nothing escapes it. Nothing is so perfect that it does not descend to its tomb. Rivers, rivulets, fountains, and waters flow, but never return to their joyful beginnings. Anxiously they hasten on the vast realms of the rain god. As they widen their banks, they also fashion the sad urn of their burial. Filled are the bowels of the earth with pestilential dust, once flesh and bone. Once animate bodies of man who sat upon thrones, decided cases, presided in council, commanded armies, conquered provinces, possessed treasure, destroyed temples, exulted in their pride, majesty, fortune, praise, and power. Vanished are these glories, just as the fearful smoke vanishes that belches forth from the internal fires of Popocatépetl, the sacred volcano. Nothing recalls them but the written page. So that is the Aztecs, and that wraps up the lecture. I look forward to hearing any questions that you have. I think I saw, back there's the first one. Yeah, in the red sweater. Yeah, definitely. Women were often merchants, or were sellers in the marketplace, was a big role. Women were often healers, and they played roles in religion as well. There were several important goddesses, and there are a number of scholars that have really focused on the roles of women. Actually have a good deal of information about this compared to some of the other societies, since we have the Spanish eyewitness accounts, and then we also have descriptions by Aztecs later. That's a good question. So the question would be, how far north did the Aztec influence go? There's not any evidence for Aztecs being present in the modern-day U.S. So when you hear of sites, like Aztec Ruin in New Mexico, that has nothing to do with the Aztecs. But it is a good question. And when we come to Cahokia, the site of Cahokia later on in the Mississippian world, that is a big matter of debate. So that was an earlier culture, and there do seem to be some very strong connections with Mesoamerica more generally. The Aztecs in particular, nothing, but there is a lot of cultural interchange between these areas earlier on. I don't even know how to keep track of these. I saw you.
Two things. How much was the tribute, or like as a percentage, were they demanded, and how did they go about collecting it?
As a percentage, it would have varied widely on the circumstances. It was enough that it was a burden. It was burdensome. And some of the most interesting, some very interesting archaeological studies have been on how people had to change their daily rhythms to accommodate tribute. For instance, one thing that's quite interesting is we know from the kinds of vessels people used that they tended to switch from making a mash porridge, which people had eaten when they had worked in their fields and then just gone home for the day. Instead, the women in households had to start making tortillas, which were more portable, so that people doing tribute could take them with them when they were away from home. So they were onerous. They were difficult, and yeah, there were state appointed individuals that would come in and do the tribute collection. Okay, I'm going to go all the way over there. Right, those are good questions. Sorry, thanks for reminding me. So the questions are about disease. One was disease actually a factor in the conquest of the Aztecs, given the really short time frame. It was 4 years from when the Spanish got there to when they conquered the Aztecs. Second question was whether disease was ever used intentionally as a weapon by Europeans. Okay, so yes, disease was definitely part of the Aztec conquest. This is recorded firmly by the Spanish eyewitnesses who were there. This painting is actually from the Aztecs themselves, from one of their, later on they created this book and were depicting the ravages of smallpox here. And in particular, when the Spanish first came to Tenochtitlan and then they were kicked out and spent time outside the city carrying a siege, the whole city was being ravaged by disease at this time. So we know even in that small incident, it was already having an effect. The second question was about whether disease was used as a weapon. There's not much evidence for that, and this would be a debatable question since this was obviously before the germ theory of disease had been developed. So people in both the New World and the Old World understood disease as an act of God. Ostensibly, they didn't really understand transmission, but that seems a bit debatable to me. So we don't know that it was used as a weapon intentionally. Okay, I'm going to go to this at the very back. Okay. Can you speak up a bit? How did I? Oh, in the Aztecs or the whole course? Archaeology? Sadly, I am probably one of the products of the Indiana Jones time frame. It's true. There's a lot of us that really, really like that movie. But it was just fascinating. You know, I was a very dorky kid, still very dorky, and I loved to read about ancient Egypt as it started. But Great. Well, we're gonna hopefully you'll like the part of we're gonna get to Tuscaloosa later on in the course. You probably know there's a big site nearby. Okay, I'm gonna go in the middle of the room here at the very back. Okay, so the question was human sacrifice in any way linked to an advancement in medical knowledge as a result? I don't think there would be a direct result or direct linkage between the human sacrifice and medical knowledge, but that is an interesting area of study, and a lot of Native peoples did have very advanced medical knowledge, and particularly with the study of plants. In some cases, surgery went on with great rates of success. The victims of human sacrifice experienced various ends. To my knowledge, they were never dissected or studied in any way. In some cases, some cannibalism was part of what happened, or just burials or placing the head on the skull rack. But that is an interesting point of study. There were a lot of advanced medical innovations, and definitely passed on in folklore and folk practices today. Okay, I want to pick right in front here in the middle.
You mentioned that the Aztecs were not interested in the acquisition of land, but rather material, and that was unlike the Europeans who were interested in the acquisition of land. That is very similar to Cherokee nation today, which does not believe that, or at one time did not believe that land belongs to human beings. They belong to God. Did the Cherokees get that from the Aztecs? That train of thought that land cannot be owned by man, but man is a part of land.
The question is whether the Aztec view of land ownership and expansion is similar to the Cherokee notion of lack of land ownership, really, or impossibility of land ownership. Well, so given the fact that the Aztecs didn't ever come into North America, it would not have been a directly Aztec idea. I'm not sure how long the Cherokee have been a nation, but possibly as long as the Aztecs anyway. But that's a common, there are all kinds of different understandings of land ownership and the relationship to territory and land throughout the New World. So for a lot of groups, the land belonged to the state directly, in the case of the Inca, or it belonged to the deities, or it belonged to the community. Yeah, well, there's the question. Right. So for a lot of people, it's about meaningful places and places that were of value to your community, that had belonged to your ancestors, and there's more of a sense of connection. Yeah. Yeah. Right. So you get lots of different examples of the relationship to land. Okay. The man back there is leaping out of his seat. Okay. Right. So yeah, when you get the different societies that were hunting and gathering on the land rather than having agriculture, you get a very different relationship too. Okay, back there. Sorry, who? Good question. Everyone got sacrificed. The most valuable sacrifices were elites. Notably, that often turned out to be the elites of other city-states. Slaves were also sacrificed a lot too. So when people had to fulfill ritual obligations and things didn't pan out, they didn't have a war captive on hand, you could go to the market and buy a slave to be sacrificed to. But all members of society were subject to that, but mostly from other areas. Yes. I'll get back to you. That's a good. Much less. There were, I think, 5 Aztec kings in Aztec history. So the time span we're talking about, from the founding of Tenochtitlan, the founding of the empire, until its collapse, was 1325 to 1521, so less than 200 years. The empire was probably assembled even faster than that, since it had been in place for a while when Cortez arrived, so under 100 years, yeah. Okay, back there. Ever discovered the wheel? Yeah. So the question is, why did no one in the New World discover the wheel? I'll wrap up with this question since we're heading out. They did discover the wheel. At least in Mesoamerica, the Maya, I believe, had little toys with wheels. So people found it, but they didn't find it of much use. There are a number of reasons for this. If you go to the Andes, and you'll see roads crossing mountains and rocky crags, wheels don't go very well on that kind of road. And then you get to areas with swamps and deserts. Wheels are not necessarily always best suited to the environment. It's hard to explain why they didn't adopt the wheel, but the fact is they didn't, and they were still, just using the labor of people's backs, they were able to, create these incredible things. I don't know if speed was so much an issue in the getting away from them. It could have been, yeah. Okay, one last, are we in? Okay. 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 Thank you. Thanks.